the neoclassical synthesis. We already know what happened to classical economics, but we're going to say it again. Classical economics dominates economics until we get to the Great Depression, and the Great Depression outcomes at least appear to be inconsistent with classical economics. Plus, as time goes on in economics, we develop more and more theories of market failure, theories of when markets don't work, and of course, markets working is essential to classical economics. In macro, classical is replaced by the Keynesians, not Keynes, but the Keynesians. The Keynesians took Keynes's theory, they dropped money out of it, they dropped financial markets out of it, they changed the way expectations work in it, and it lasted up until the leisure suit point of life. It lasted up until the 1970s, and it couldn't, the way it was constructed, couldn't explain the 1970s. So what happens? In the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, we have a fight. We have the Keynesians represented here by the second person to win a Nobel Prize in economics, Paul Samuelson. The Keynesians took Keynes, they removed a bunch of stuff, and they developed very complex mathematical models of the economy that they used to try to predict and poke and prod, like pretending to be Isaac Newton. On the other side were the monetarists, who really are the classicals, led by Milton Friedman there, and they tried to restore classical economics using the quantity theory of money. So Keynesians versus monetarists, which is really Keynesians versus classicals. It's also Harvard versus the University of Chicago. So here's Milton Friedman. Not my favorite guy. Just won't explain that, but not my favorite guy. What did he bring to the table? Well, he started us on a couple paths. One is this idea that there's a natural real GDP. Natural, bringing back Adam Smith's word, natural, suggesting that, again, based on classical economics, there is a long-run natural position for the economy. So it's because of that that we get short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. Friedman didn't do the drawing, but it's his work that sends us that way. Related to that, we have a natural rate of unemployment. We understand that unemployment's never going to hit zero. You should already understand why that is. So there is a natural rate of unemployment that goes with natural real GDP. There's this long-term position of the economy. And again, he's going to dispute Keynes's stuff. He's going to go back to saying real wages matter. He's going to tell us that there is no multiplier effect, that spending doesn't matter, blah, blah, blah. All of Keynes's assertions that are contradictory to the classicals, Uncle Milty is going to dispute. So there's this big fight. Milton Friedman's theory is based on what we call the quantity theory of money. And it's this little equation that I just wrote out here, which says M times V equals P times Q equals GDP. So M is the money supply, V is the velocity of money, and we'll explain what that means in a minute. P is the price level, and Q stands for real GDP. So M times V is equal to nominal GDP. It's equal to the total nominal GDP. P times Q is equal to the nominal GDP. And if you notice something, you notice that aggregate demand and supply, we have prices on the y-axis and real GDP on the x-axis. So essentially aggregate demand and supply is hidden away in this equation. How do we have a 20 trillion GDP if we only have $2 trillion in money? How do we have $20 trillion in GDP if we only have $2 trillion in money? The answer is that when you go spend your money at the store, it doesn't just stop there. It keeps getting spent. The store give it to somebody else, and then somebody else will spend it, and then somebody else will spend it. So what we're getting is money spent more than one time. if we take that GDP and we divide it by M, 20 trillion divided by 2 trillion, that gives us the number 10, which is the velocity of money. And what that's telling us is the average dollar got spent 10 times in a year. So now flip back to this equation. What happens if the velocity is constant? If that number 10 is just a constant, it stays that 10 over time. And what happens if real GDP is basically constant over time? Well, that means that M and P are going to be related. That the price level, how high or low prices are, is going to be determined entirely by how much money there is. So if the amount of money goes up, prices have to go up. If the amount of money goes down, prices have to go down. That's the traditional quantity theory of money, the old school quantity theory of money that economists have known about or believed in for thousands of years, literally thousands of years. That money and prices are intimately related and that V and Q are basically constants. Now, Friedman is going to ask another different sort of question. He's going to say, yeah, V's constant. Everybody knows V's constant, which we'll get back to. But everybody knows V's constant. What happens if P can go up but P can't go down? How often do we see prices go down? Prices always go up. What happens if P can't go down? Ooh. Well, if M goes down and V can't change and P can't go down, Q has to go down. Real GDP has to fall. So now we have a really interesting equation. If those assumptions hold, Milton Friedman can argue that if we have too much money, we get inflation. P goes up. If we have not enough money, real GDP goes down and we have a recession. So now we have this very simple equation that tells us a reason why we would have inflation, why we would have unemployment, gives us this whole world view. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is that V is not constant either. So M is a variable, V is a variable, P is a variable, and Q is a variable. And you have an equation that's really meaningless. It tells us, we know that in the end of the year, if we sit down at the end of the year and put in M and V and P and Q, they work out and they're equal and we get just nominal GDP and yep. But we can't explain or predict anything really using this equation. It's fun, but we can't really use it for anything other than as an identity to tell us that these things are what they are. However, it's going to send us into some world. It certainly can't explain the 70s either. So we're going to get to the 70s, and we've had these two groups fighting with each other. Yes? So here we go. We're the Rock'em Sock'em Robots. For 25 years, we've been beating on each other and beating on each other, the Keynesians and the monetarists and the Keynesians and the monetarists and the Keynesians and the monetarists. And both our heads pop up. And neither the Keynesians nor the monetarists win that argument. Okay, it's basically everybody knows that nobody won. But over time, we're going to take some stuff. We're going to take little pieces of things and make things, well, we're going to make things. So here's what happens. We start back with classical economics. Okay? This was, if you recall, called the neoclassical synthesis. Neo means new classical. We're going to start back with classical economics. We're going to add Uncle Milty's idea, Milton Friedman's idea of this natural rate of unemployment, natural real GDP, this idea that there's this separation between the long run and the short run and why there is. We're going to add something called rational expectations. Keynes believes that expectations are unknown, unpredictable, animal spirits. You can't do math with that. And economists were heck bent on being mathy and putting math into everything and building these mathematical models. Well, if Keynes is right, you can't do that. We might as well, ignore all that. But we don't do that. So we add something called rational expectations. And rational expectation says, yes, people have expectations. They look at the future, but basically their expectations match the theory. So whatever the theory says their expectation should be, that's what their expectations are. So expectations go into the model and into the equations, but in a way that's all nicely predictable. And of course, if you actually believe in Keynes, you just have to roll over on that one. But it gets added into this model, these rational expectations. But then, we allow for market failure in the short run. So the model says, look, what happens if we take classical economics and say, in the long run, everything's going to be fine. There's this natural rate of unemployment. We have rational expectations. But let's allow the possibility that there could be market failure in the short run, that markets maybe don't work perfectly in the short run. And what do we get? We get the neoclassical synthesis, which is simply this idea that classical economics is right in the long run, plus a couple other ideas, plus this idea that we can have market failure in the short run, that markets might not be predictable in the short run. So do we get peace in our time? That would be no. What we're going to see is this whole thing of still fractures, and we're going to get multiple points of view, and that's the next exciting thing we're going to talk about.